Okay, recording's on. Welcome back to the study hall for November 19th. Got some sentence correction today. We're going to be doing some problems that feature the comma ing structure and or issues with overall structure. Could be one or the other of those. Could be both if the problem is especially a party. But there's going to be those things in there. Let's try one. How about that one? Give it a shot. Okay, this is the place where, remember, multiple choice answers are here. You find them underneath your name. You'll see this letter A, and that's where I use a pull-down menu of answers. Okay, also remember that whenever we have sentence correction as a theme for one of these things, it is usually a little bit easier because there's a known theme. So you know at least that that's a thing that you should think about. For instance, you know that today's problems are going to contain either one or both of these problems. They're either going to have comma ing in them, or they're going to have overall structure issues of some type. So at least at the starting point. The deal, though, is that if you do look at some type of thing because it's the theme of the day, then in retrospect, at least, you should make sure that you have a reason to look at it. So, for example, if you analyze overall structure here, you should make sure that you have a reason why you are analyzing overall structure here. So, okay, let's take a look. So, there are definitely some overall structure issues in this problem. You guys know what I mean by overall structure issues, right? It's like either this is a sentence or it's not a sentence. So how do you know that that's an issue? Like today, you know it's going to be happening, these problems, because Ron said these problems have overall structure issues. But how do you detect overall structure issues? When should you look for them? Sometimes when the entire thing is underlined, but not always. There are actually some sentences with overall structure issues where only a couple words are underlined. So that term run-on is one of the ways that overall structure can be wrong, but that's not really a cue. Like, in other words, here, there's a blank you should be able to fill in this sentence. If I see blank, I should consider overall structure. It goes in that blank. Generally, meaning's not going to be affected too much by it. Aha, we're getting there. I don't remember what a clause means, Evan, so I don't know if that's right. It could be right or wrong. Aha, I like these last three answers. No verb, modifiers being moved around. Because, I mean, if you think about it, a good way for you to tell when you should look for certain types of errors is to make those errors yourself and see what you have to change to introduce those errors. Like, for example, here's a sentence. My dog likes to sleep. Okay, that's a sentence. Okay, if I want to make that into something that's not a sentence, there's a couple of ways I can do it, but the point is to look at how it changes when I do that. So one way to make this not a sentence is to get rid of the verb and to make it a modifier instead, like my dog really likes to sleep. This one's not a sentence. The first one is a legitimate sentence. That's not supposed to be doggo. It's just supposed to be dog. And then, like, another way I can make a quote, sentence, unquote, that's not really a sentence is to toss another subject in there. That's also not a sentence because you can't have two subjects in a row. So the point of creating these is to look at these and figure out what's the difference. And then, like, what visible difference exists is really the question. Because then this is going to be the kind of decision point or split that you look for in the problems. Because, like, you know, people are saying things in the chat box that are not wrong, but they're not really just things that you see. For example, you don't just see a run-on sentence, especially when it's, like, several lines long and half of it is up in the underline and half of it's not. That's not really a thing, right? The thing you see is the difference. So here's the kind of difference I'm talking about here. You got this, which is a verb. And then notice that that's replaced by something that isn't a verb. Like, now it's a modifier. So again, just put some captions on that. That's a verb up there. That's a modifier. And then you got other kinds of issues here too, like you're not supposed to have more than one of these key elements unless you're connecting them with words like and or whatever. So you can't have two subjects next to each other like that either. And like the point is that one of these, that's not a split because I only wrote the wrong version, but notice that one of these will have to go away in other choices because one of the sentences has to be correct. So in other words, if you look at the correct sentence up there, it only has one subject. So dog versus dog eat. So you can start by looking at these kind of things. So let's see what we have here. So notice, for example, processing, let's color modifiers in green. Having processed as a modifier, opened and rebuilt are verbs. So those are non-modifiers. In this choice, we've got ing modifier. Processing, blah, 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 blah. And then we have verbs opened and rebuilt. Opened is a verb, but then being rebuilt is structured here as a modifier. These are modifiers. Processed is a verb in this problem, in this version of it. And then entering is a modifier. And then of all of those people, the Federal Immigration Station processed is a verb. And then having done those things is a modifier. So this is the kind of thing, right? I mean, because what we're doing here is it's much more involved in the sense there's a lot more stuff there. But it's really the same thing that's happening between these two examples here. It's like the difference between my dog likes to sleep and my dog who likes to sleep. One of these is a sentence with verb. The other one is not a sentence and doesn't have a verb. Any questions about this distinction? So you've got to have a sentence with a verb. That means that A is not a sentence. So that's gone. What about the rest of those? Somehow comma ing works. Or ing comma if it's after. We'll go ahead and take a picture of this and put it on the next page. You're going to see a blank page for a second. And then the current version of the problem will load shortly. Okay, we've got so far. So if you don't see a picture yet, you'll see it in a little bit. sometimes these graphics take a while to load. So we got choice A is gone because choice A is not actually a sentence. But the others at least are sentences. The others have a complete sentence structure. Let's talk about comma INGs now. See where we've got those. Let's pick a different color for that. How about this like pastel, very masculine pastel purple color here? There's an ING. Comma ING. In fact, let me put that there. That's a comma ING. That is an ING also separated by a comma. If it comes before, the implications are a bit different. We'll talk about it. This one is structured very similarly to that. This one doesn't have a comma ING, and then finally this one does. Okay, what is the story with comma ING? What does it do? Let me have a summary, or can anybody type an example of a sentence that uses it correctly? Because remember, the true test of your understanding of these things is whether you can use them in examples. That's really the test. If you have something in like abstract rule form, it's not going to be super useful for the most part. But if you can make examples that use these things, then that's how you show that you actually understand them. All right, I like that one. Okay, let's take that and use it as a comma ING sentence that works. So okay, a sentence that works. Swimming in the ocean, and then just to avoid the pronoun issue, I'll put a name for this guy. Swimming in the ocean. Dan saw a dolphin. Hannah, that sentence would be a little bit weird unless all of the things you like are unhealthy, and that's like generally something people know about you. Otherwise, you would probably want to have something like even though or something like that. It's not a great example because there would have to be lots of background knowledge about you for it to make sense. But this, okay, let's talk about this. What's the deal here? What's the relationship between swimming in the ocean and saw a dolphin? There's two things to think about here. The first is which one is the main point. The second is what's the time frame relationship, because both of those are encapsulated here. Okay, the main point, which of course should be expressed by the main sentence, which is why it is called the main sentence, is that Dan saw a dolphin. Now here's the deal. When you put an ING comma construction in front, you're implying two things about this. First thing that you're implying, so two implications of this construction. First implication is that, as a couple of you have pointed out, Antoine and Jean, you pointed out, maybe that's Jean, maybe it's John, maybe it's Jeannie. The time frame, right? Number one is that this is already happening when, so like the main action happens during this one. In other words, this is already going on when the main action occurs, when the main verb happens. So, I mean, of course, right, Dan's already swimming when he sees a dolphin. So, And then, of course, there's the whole idea of modifier versus main sentence, which is it's less important or less central to the meaning of the sentence than the main verb, which is why the main verb is the main verb. I mean, remember that modifiers should always be, at the end of the day, not the main point, which is why they are modifiers and not the main sentence. But as far as really critiquing the use of these things, this is going to be usually the issue when there is an issue. Because I mean, let's look at that guy up there. Let's look at that. Having processed nearly 3. Because okay, the point of this sentence, and of course the first step of every sentence correction problem in the world all the time, is to understand what it's even trying to tell you. What happened first in this sentence? Like, what actually happened first according to common sense and this context here? And the rebuilding, yeah, I mean, it was open first, right? Opened in 1892, and then it started processing immigrants. I mean, rebuilt, we don't as much know. That could have happened during the processing period. I mean, who knows, right? But the deal is that it had to open first, and then it had to start processing people after it was open. So that makes choice. In fact, what's interesting about this problem is that this entire crowd of people only picked 2 answers to it. There's your crowd statistics right there. Everybody picked either boy or dog. We had a bunch of non-responders. You shouldn't really be a non-responder, by the way. This test doesn't let you not answer things. So, but the choice that this is the only wrong answer that people selected. Now you see what the problem is, right? Swimming in the ocean, that's already going on. Dan's already doing that. And boom, he sees a dolphin. You can see why this does not fly. Because this would imply that the processing, in fact, that the having process, so it had already processed a bunch of immigrants before it even opened. So that's definitely not a thing. Right. The implication here is that the processing was already ongoing when the station opened. So, I mean, it's definitely an incorrect relationship. It's not cause and effect, not necessarily. I mean, had Dan not been swimming in the ocean here, he certainly would not have seen a dolphin. But this kind of construction doesn't necessarily imply cause and effect. I mean, you can definitely have these kinds of sentences without causality. I mean, you can say, like, walking down the street, comma, I was startled by 2 men running out of one of the stores. I mean, this is not causality, right? The fact that I was walking down the street did not cause these people to run out and startle me. So, but it's just the ongoing, this is the sort of background action. And another way that you can think of it is like background, foreground, right? Swimming in the ocean, and Dan's doing this in the background, and then he sees a dolphin. So, but the relationship is just, it's not the same. Kind of the implication here for these same reasons. Choice B is telling us that the processing was already ongoing when the station opened. That's not right. Not a thing. I mean, C's got the same issue. Processing, blah, 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 comma, it first opened. This is also exactly the same problem as B. So, nope. If we look at choice D, though, that's not the same type of modifier. I mean, first opened in 1892, then rebuilt in 1900. So these are just things that were done to it. That works. And so there's a lesson about this kind of modifier here that just can't describe things that are beforehand. So these things happen. Rebuild could have happened during the processing. In fact, it probably did. But there's not the same necessary time frame relationship as you have with ing. Any questions about these so far? Nobody picked E, but it's still worth looking at this. Here's another sentence that works. I think if you've seen these study halls enough, you've probably seen this exact sentence because I tend to pull it out as an example of comma ing. But I dropped the bags on the floor, comma, scaring the dog. Okay, how's that work? What's the deal there? That's how people are typing. Yeah. The actions happen first, then I scare the dog. Really? Is that true? Different sort of time frame here. Yeah, it's got to be at the same time. And this is actually, it's interesting that you would raise that point, because if this were something that could be construed as this happened before and this happened later, then this would actually be a completely incorrect construction. So we're going to come back to that because I actually have a problem in today's slides where that is the issue. But no, these things have to be the same thing. Like, notice that the dropping the bags is the thing that scared the dogs. You cannot think of these. It is impossible to think of this as something that happened first and this as something that happened second, because they are the same. Like, the dogs were scared when I dropped the bags. In other words, if you drew a timeline with little dots to represent when actions happened, these would be the same dot on a timeline. Like, you couldn't have, at 5:20 p.m. I dropped the bags, and then at 5:22 I scared the dogs. Can't do it, right? Same time frame. So notice that. And actually, so we were going to have point 3 up there too. I dropped yeah, unless you were like already kind of freaking out the dogs in some other way, and then you drop the bags to make them freak out even more. Then maybe, but that would be a different incident. So notice what's going on here. Notice a couple of things. Time frame thing. Same time frame as the main action. This is essential, by the way. I mean, you cannot be separate. You cannot separate these things in time. So this is going to be important, and I'm going to give you a couple more examples of this in a bit. In fact, let me just give you the examples now, and then we will come back to them for a later problem too. So here, fresh new page for a second. All right, so comma ing, well, that's really big. Why is that so big? Here. Okay, we learned on another page is that comma ing must be this. Let me give you a couple examples of this. Here is a sentence that works. And here is a sentence that does not work. Okay, so again, we label these very clearly. This works, and this doesn't work. Okay, I mean, again, just make sure that this is, I mean, I'm even going to be annoying and draw number lines, but if you, just to represent the passage of time here, right? Like if you draw this number line too, represent passing of time, then there's only one dot on this number line, so to speak. Right? There's this dot. This represents hit by the bus, and this also represents death. It is absolutely impossible to consider these as two separate things on the timeline, because that's what instantly is. It's like at the same time. So Smiley, we'll come back to that modifier in a bit. So this is hit by bus, and this is death. Same place in the timeline. Okay, smiley face icon, if that makes sense. You see what I mean by that, giving the smiley icon. Whereas this doesn't work because this violates what ing requires. ing requires that it work like that. And if we have a timeline here, then there's an hour in between these things. So this is going to matter in a problem that we're going to see shortly too. So like the deal is that this is 1 hour. If there's any sort of separation of time here, then cannot do it. This is hit by a bus, and this is that. So ing cannot be used to write this. You would actually have to separate them with a separating word such as and. So for instance, you could write this sentence as Colin was struck by a bus and died in the hospital an hour later. Connecting them to show that they are two actions that are separated from each other. So this would work. Okay. So this is going to be important. We're going to come back to this in a little bit. But, okay. So there's that. It's got to be the same time frame. And then there's the fact that it's a modifier. I mean, don't forget that modifiers have to be modifiers. Which means it's got to be a description. So it must describe the main action in some way. It could be, what it is here is it's a consequence, but it's not like a delayed consequence. It's like an immediate, simultaneous consequence is one way it can work. But that's one way it can be thing. These are just examples. I mean, ings can do lots of things. I mean, it could also be a further description. It could also be subordinate actions. And then et cetera. Notice the et cetera at the end here. I mean, as long as it's some sort of description. And then actually there's a point number 3 that goes on both of these, which is who is swimming in the ocean? I mean, the obvious question of the day, not a trick question. Who is swimming in the ocean? Dan was. If you're going to use the ing, it's got to have the person who was doing that right there. So that's point number 3 about that construction. Is that the immediately following subject must be the person or thing who does the ing action. Now see, this is direct. This is like Dan was actually swimming. Now the way this works here is a little bit different. But it's the same idea, but it's not exactly the same, because in this sentence, it's not quite true to say I scared the dogs, because that's not really true. It's more like the action that I did. But the deal is, if you had to answer the question like who or what was most directly responsible for scaring the dogs, then the answer would be me. So, like, the deal is that the action, the main action, should be described directly. But also, of the nouns in the sentence, like of the people or things in the sentence, the subject should be most directly responsible for the ing action. Like, it's not really the subject, because actually the whole point of comma ing is to specifically say, look, I didn't really scare the dogs, but my action did. That's actually what this is for. I mean, if I, like, you know, got in front of the dogs and was like, ooh, then that would be I scared the dog. But this specifically is like, this action did that, and that is only, I mean, unless it's something like this. It can be a direct subject, like Colin actually died. But in the case of something like this, it could just be most directly if it's an action that actually did something. So it's sort of a complicated idea, but hopefully I'm conveying it reasonably well. Because, like, the point of the sentence is that there's no noun that really did this. Like, the bags did not scare the dogs, and I did not directly scare the dogs. So that's what this construction conveys best, is that it was this whole action that did that. So, smiley face if that makes sense. If the example makes sense, smiley face icon, which is the most important thing. I mean, if the example makes sense, then if all the talking about it doesn't, then as long as you understand the example, that's basically what counts. So the deal is, again, I mean, this is still, the time frame thing is still the issue. Like, if we have this same thing that we talked about with the other one, it's got to be the same time frame. So there's no way. I mean, you can't process nearly 3/4 of the immigrants. It's not the same time frame as having first openings. Because this happened first. So, also not okay. There's a question about the modifier. There's a bunch of clutter in this problem. Let me just copy paste it so that I can address that with a little bit less clutter. Here is the question that I'm responding to. So that modifier could be correct, but as used here it isn't, because it creates redundancy. And let me specifically show you how that is so. I mean, notice that it is of all the immigrants, the immigration station processed 3/4 of them. Whoops, yeah, can't have both of those. So, right, I mean, because those are both expressing the same meaning, so that's redundant. It's not the modifier itself that is the problem. It's the fact that it is there and that other thing is also there. Yeah, you could say of all 200 contestants, comma, only 3 advanced to the final round. That works. You could also say only 3 of the 200 contestants advanced to the final round. That works. But you cannot say, let me just be lazy and copy paste it. You can't have both of those. So you could not have all 200 contestants, only 3 of them. So yeah, just to make sure it's clear, this works, this works, this does not work. Smiley icon if that makes sense, especially Gene who asked the question. Okay, let me dig up this, no problem. You're welcome. Let me dig up this other problem that I'm looking for. And specifically got that same issue in it. Might take me a second to find it. Well, where are you? There it is. All right. Try this one. Remember where the multiple choice answers are found. So they're there. All right, give it a shot. think about Colin and being hit by the bus. I'm kind of giving away the game here, but think about that. Alright, this is the point where we should probably pick an answer. Yeah, I think you probably, at least hopefully, you can see the relevance to these examples that I made up. Where, let's see, those are here. Okay. Again, you cannot use ing unless these are inseparable on a time axis. Like in this example here, I dropped the bags onto the floor, scaring the dogs. This is one action that did both of these things. So you couldn't put two dots on a timeline for this because it was actually this is two descriptions of what is ultimately the same event. Same thing here, this is also two descriptions of what is ultimately just one event. If it's even possible to separate them on a time axis, then ing is not a thing. So if we look at that with that consideration in mind, concluding is not the same thing as finding evidence. Like if you think about the way scientists use evidence, I mean, there's a mental process that intervenes between finding the evidence and making conclusions from it, right? So if you're going to put this on a timeline, that's going to be two dots. It's not going to be one dot. It's not going to be, because it is two, I mean, there are intervening steps. So in other words, you've got one dot for they found this evidence, and then this other dot is drew some conclusions about it. And in this interim, there's like some thinking that goes on. Smiley face if this makes sense. Because it is possible. You could have a similar type of sentence in which the ing time frame could work. For instance, let me make one up. Like if you versus, here's a sentence. Scientists discovered irrefutable evidence that Mars was once covered with water, disproving the hypothesis that the planet has always been dry. Okay, because like this is correct. This is a correct use of ing. Because this is not disproving, is actually, that's what happens when they find the evidence. And the evidence itself is the disprove. So there's no intervening time frame or thought process here. This is a single dot on a time axis. Like whenever they found this evidence, is also that was the it's like I dropped the bag, scared dog, find evidence, and disprove other hypothesis. It is one thing, because that discovery was the thing that disproved the hypothesis. So this makes ing work in this case. However, because these are two different things on a time axis, can't use ing here. It's not a thing. Smiley icon if that makes sense. Because it's in recent eras? No, it's got nothing to do with that. It has to do with the fact that finding stuff and then thinking about it and then drawing conclusions from it, that those are separate processes. So remember, if it is, unless it is indisputably the same event. You cannot use comma ing. Like, think about the examples that you've seen of this person was hit by a bus, comma, dying instantly. Can't separate those. That's the whole point of instantly. Or I dropped the bags onto the floor, comma, scaring the dogs. I mean, that's one event. The same event of dropping the bags is what scared the dogs. So, I mean, this seems like a nitpick, but again, this is why they give you multiple choices to put this kind of difference front and center. Because it would be harder to catch this if you were just looking at a single sentence. But that's what this whole difference is all about. It's kind of like what we had here. Where is it? Where did it go? There it is. I mean, it's like seeing these two options where you're presented with this and then you are presented with that. Okay, well, I know exactly what the difference is. This is like it's one event. It's two events. So again, I mean, a lot of people make this harder for themselves than it needs to be by trying to consider every choice independently. Make sure you're not doing that, right? This means this is one event. This means two events. Multiple choice makes this much more obvious than it otherwise would be. So same sort of thing, comma concluding means this is all a single event, which is not true. And have concluded that works. So this is two events. All right. Clarify the comparisons. Yeah, well, I mean, let's make sure we're finished with talking about this part. So, okay, are there any other questions about this? Okay. All right. So there's a couple of things. I mean, E you should be able to knock out pretty quickly just because there's no such thing as more as. You don't have, that's not a thing. I mean, as much as is a thing. But more as is not. So, nope. More than, as much as. This is a pretty basic difference. I mean, by the way, when it comes to things like idioms, these are the only ones you really have to worry about, are the ones that, like, basically everybody knows. You know, like, if you've had any decent amount of exposure to the English language, then you're going to know that it's not this. It's not a thing. The challenge, again, is noticing it, but that's multiple choices are your friend again. Like, you'll notice that, whoa, this one randomly put more there, whereas, like, all the other choices have as much. So, because also you have the same issue here in reverse. Here you've got as much than. Whoopsies, that doesn't work either. So, and then nobody picked D, although a couple of things about that. The first thing about this, pronoun issues, not really, because it's pretty obvious that this is scientists and that this is Mars. There's a couple of things, though. First thing is, I'm going to greatly exaggerate this difference, but here's something that you can look at. Here's a sentence. Just going to type it out. And here's another sentence. Okay, somebody tell me what is the deal with those sentences. Don't think about this too hard. When you look at those two sentences, what do you think? I mean, there are no errors, theoretically speaking, in either of these two sentences. But what is the deal with these? If you see them next to each other, what? Yeah, like the point is, and again, like these two examples are unlike theirs in the sense that nothing is actually technically wrong with either of these, whereas all of their wrong answers will actually be wrong. But the deal is that, you know, whatever you want to call it, you can use fancy words like that if you want, but the point is that this is obviously better. This is obviously worse writing, and this is obviously better writing. And the point is that this is not technically an issue of right and wrong, but one thing that you can rest assured of is that the correct answers will never contain worse writing than the incorrect answers. So what this means is that if you see this kind of distinction, notice the word distinction, like if you notice a comparison like this, and if the difference is obvious enough, then you can trust in it as an elimination criterion. So, but just make sure that you are making this judgment as a relative judgment. Make sure that you are never looking at one choice and saying, I don't like that. But if you see a comparison like this, you can confidently eliminate the answer that contains worse writing. You know, if you can just, because I mean, one thing that you'll notice about this is that the choices that are hardest to eliminate on other grounds are sometimes the ones that are easiest to eliminate by just being like, yeah, that's just icky writing. So, like for instance, I mean, by the way, D is also wrong for the reason of having as much than. You can also just knock it off for the same reason as E. So I'm going to problem in 3 choices. But you can also just look at D and be like, this is just worse than C. And so even if you don't notice the as much than, you can still catch it on those grounds too. So was is not a problem there. I mean, if you have was, you don't really need previously, but that's not, I mean, the was is not in and of itself incorrect. The last thing, by the way, about this, the placement of therefore is not so significant here. As long as it's next to concluded, because that is the thing that is actually therefore. So, and it is in all of those choices. The last thing, though, is just think about the meaning of this. Just think about that. Does that even mean anything? Up to 3 times as much water or more. Okay, what? I mean, here's an analogy. Like, stuff in the store costs up to $40 or more. I mean, if you just think about this for a second, this could be absolutely any price at all. Up to 40 or more. What? I mean, that could be $1 million, or it could be like 2 cents. So this is a completely meaningless statement. So you can also knock it off on those graphs. I mean, yeah, it's Crust Harbor's some amount of water. Congratulations, guys. It's like, you know, things in the store cost some amount of money. Well, great. I mean, this is clearly not the message. The message has to limit the amount of water. So you can also just knock it out because it's nonsense. Same sort of thing in B boy. Up to this much or more. Well, again, that's like any number in the world. So, whoopsie. That pixie first, but I was afraid it was that what you're writing there implies that you don't know what a run-on is. This is the problem with terminology. Terminology is not your friend. Quote, run-on, unquote, has nothing to do with length at all. when people say run on, that just means that you have two sentences instead of one, and that they are connected. They're just slapped right into each other, or they have nothing between them except a comma. Like you're missing a proper connector. Like if you say, like, you can go now, I'm home. This is what people call a run-on sentence. That has nothing to do with length. I mean, this is very short. But the problem is that this is a complete sentence, and this is another complete sentence. And you can't stick two complete sentences to each other. You put a semicolon there, you can put a because, you got some sort of connector. But I mean, not real sure what you're saying about length anyway, because C is second shortest choice. So not quite sure what you're saying about length, but it is, the length is not, I mean, that choice is not longer than the other choices. Anyway, though, just make sure that you are looking at things that are things. Like, I mean, either concrete differences that are single things. Like, notice there's the yellow thing, and there's the green thing, and there's the blue thing. Or else you could look at the writing of the choices as a whole, but if you're doing that, that has to be a comparison. Again, as I'm saying this 1,000 billion million times, but you can't do this with individual choices. Don't do it. Just if you see two choices and it's like this one is much worse than that one, that's the time you should do that. Otherwise, you should be looking at single items. Okay, let's see if we can get another one of these going on here. Let's see what we can do. How about that one? Should be not super time consuming. Give it a shot. You're welcome, by the way. Okay, this is definitely, we should have an answer selected by this point. Let's think a thing. Okay. So here's the deal. Let's look at these again. Let's look at these examples. Let me find them again. Okay, here you go. I mean, this is a thing that comes up enough, right, to be aware of. I mean, I am sort of handpicking these problems to highlight this issue, but this has been a factor in several problems. And again, consider this and this. One event, two events. If you see a difference between comma ing versus and other verb in these choices, then that's what they're testing there. I mean, notice that the recordings, yeah, it'll be posted sometime next week. All of the recordings are on the same Thursday's webpage. And here's what I want to point out at the risk of sort of pulling teeth here, but here's what I want everybody here to notice. The point is, if you see these things, if you look at these things one at a time, you will have no idea what's being tested. Because if you look at comma ing, I mean, in fact, on this previous page, look how many things that we wrote about it. I mean, we have at least three, and really this third point could, in and of itself, be like a couple of sub-points, right? So there's at least 3 or 4 things that comma ing could be dealing with, if in fact it is even dealing with any of these things. I mean, the issue might even be something else altogether, but you know, you might be thinking about time frames. You might be thinking about which thing describes which other thing. You might be thinking about which subject is most responsible for which action. You know, like, who knows what's being tested. And the same thing when you see the word and. How many things could be tested there, right? I mean, this could be testing parallelism. This could be testing should it be and not some other transition like but or although, or it could be testing this time frame issue, or any number of other things. So that's the point. If you're looking at these one at a time, who knows which aspect of these things is being tested, right? Every construction has, at least most, I mean, most constructions have many aspects. Most constructions, I mean, because language is not simple, I mean, it's complicated. So, which one is tested? Only the shadow knows. On the other hand, if you look at these in comparison to each other, which is, I know I'm saying this 1,000 million times in a row, but it's definitely worth it. If you look at the choices comparatively, you'll know which aspect or aspects to consider. Like here we have comma ing against and verb. Like the only functional way in which those are different from each other is that this has got to be a single event and this has got to be 2 events. So, I mean, I've worked with a lot of students who have this very entrenched habit of trying to look at every single choice one at a time individually. And just make sure that you don't do that. If I had to guess where that habit comes from, I would guess that it probably comes from looking at answer keys. Because that's how answer keys are written. Like answer keys, they're like, let's talk about A, let's talk about B, let's talk about C, and so forth. But, you know, that's not really the way the problem-solving process works. I mean, the problem-solving process is let me compare these against each other and then think about what varies from one to the other. Just think about that. So we got this problem here with C eagles. Okay, so this is another interesting distribution of answers. We had A, D, E were the ones that people are picking here. The 3 choices in the middle are the ones that you can knock out for the most basic reasons. I mean, I'm going to hesitate to use words like easy because what one person thinks is easy, another person won't. But consider that and consider this. I mean, there's no it. I mean, what is the thing what brought the number of successfully raised wild birds up to 34? Yeah, it wasn't just the 5 birds. It wasn't just like, okay, these 5 random birds. It was the fact that these birds were able to leave their nests. So it was this whole action, right? So yeah, it was the departure of the birds from their nest. This action did that. So there's that you can't that action is definitely not an it. In fact, even if you thought it was just the sea eagles, that would still not be an it because that would still be a plural. So definitely not something you can use an it for. I mean, the it would have to, like, if you had the word departure here, like a noun, or if you had the the departure of these eagles from their nests. Then you could say it brought the number up to 34. Sure you could, but as it stands, there's no it. I mean, notice there's no point in wasting your time trying to assign it to a noun, because there's an intended noun, or there's an intended meaning of it. And if you can't do that, then don't waste your time trying to assign it to other nouns, right? Like this is the thing that it wants to stand for. I mean, if pronouns have desires of their own, it wants to stand for this action, but it can't. So it's wrong. Do not waste your time trying to assign it to another noun. I mean, there's no point in trying to do that, because the point is that's what it's trying to talk about. So you can't talk about that. So it's wrong. So in other words, don't be like, I don't know what it is. Is it an eagle or is it a, don't do it. Just not a thing. There's a question in the chat box earlier. Links. There's no links. I mean, there's one web page for this whole Thursdays with John thing, and you just go to it and you scroll down, and that's where all the archives are. So there's no such thing as a link. It's all on one page on the web. Okay, and then what about brings? People didn't really like this, but where's the problem? Where's the problem with brings? Brings? Okay, the tense is an issue, although, yeah, it's probably much easier to notice that this is a singular verb. Although that's also true. Being in the present tense doesn't make any sense, because this is a historical fact. I mean, this is something that happened in the past. So there are two big issues with this. You can consider either of those. First of all, this is a singular verb. And there's definitely no singular subject. I mean, if anything, you have those birds, but that's not eagles, brings, something. It's not a thing. But then there's another issue on top of that. That's a good, so Antoine and Sherry got a good eye for that. They left their nest. That's a past action. So that means, so this summer here is being used in retrospect. So this would be after summer was over. But yeah, this happened in the past. So present brings doesn't make sense. And in fact, yeah, Wajiha has a very good point. See, this initial understanding, this is the initial understanding of the sentence that you've got to have, that the birds didn't really do anything directly. It was the action that did, right? So this is, regardless of the way the sentence is originally constructed, we don't really care what the original construction of the sentence is, right? Like this is the intended message. And so therefore, this is not the intended message. I mean, in fact, this sentence works pretty much in exactly the same way as my example that I put up there before. Like I dropped a bag onto the floor, comma, scaring the dogs, versus I scared the dogs. I mean, if the meaning is that I dropped the bags on the floor and that noise like frightened the dogs, then this is an incorrect meaning. Because I didn't directly do it. Like the birds didn't wake up one day and raise a number. Like this action remember, this is the entire point of this comma ing construction, is to specifically pin the action, is to specifically pin this on the action and not on the subject per se, right? So this action scared the dog. Same sort of thing here. Like, to be most accurate, you wouldn't say that the birds left their nest. You wouldn't say that the birds brought the number up to 34, because that's not really true. And the birds didn't know about numbers. It was the action of leaving their nests brought this cumulative number up to 34, because that made them, previously there were 29 wild birds, and as soon as these ones took off, now there were 34. So, and that brings us to this distinction of A versus E. There's a couple of ways that you can do that. The first way you can do that is what G says. Seems like the birds are bringing something. It's not supposed to be a bird. It's supposed to be what the birds did. But then also we got this difference again, yet again. This difference, let me pull this slide up for the 15,000th time. We got this again. I mean, notice when you have and verb versus comma verb ing, you got to think about, is this one event or is this two events? And if it's two events, you should write it as two events, and or something like that. And if it's one event, comma ing is the thing that works. So imagine our timeline here again. I mean, how many dots are on the timeline here? You have leaving the nest, and you have bringing this number of wild birds up to 34. How many dots on the timeline is that? No, it is one, it's not two, right? Try to picture a little timeline in your head. So if this dot is the birds left the nest, the action that we've got shrouded up in purple up there. Then, you know, the same thing, that this is exactly when the number of birds transplanted to the wild, the number of birds transplanted from captivity to the wild went up from 29 to 34. I mean, this is one event. It's not two things. I mean, you could not reasonably put two dots on that timeline, because you could not two dots on the timeline. It's just one dot. So that is a thing. And again, if it seems like a small difference, back to my point about looking at differences between choices and not looking at individual choices, because then that brings this to the forefront that you should be thinking about. Two things. I mean, the first is that the birds would have to be the subject. Like Jiha points this out very, very well. Like, if you have the action did something, then you can't make a sentence that says, I scared the dogs. You have to make a sentence that says the action did it. So that's one problem. And again, you're thinking about this because comma ing does that differently. And then also there's this time frame thing. And both of these are very clearly issues if you think about A versus E, and are not so clearly issues if you're just like looking at A or just looking at E. There's so many other things you might be thinking about. So, is it now? Because including implies that you're not giving me the whole list. So that would not be correct. If you had 10 books including A, B, and C, that would work. But if that's all 3 books, then including is not correct. Okay, it is 27 after the hour, so there is definitely not enough time to do another problem. But we have some of these still left on the slides, so those will probably become the material at the next study hall. So stay tuned. Next study hall is in 2 weeks. think it's at the same time, but just check the website. It might be at the same time, it might be 2 hours later, but it's one of those. It's either the same time or 2 hours later. I can't remember which one it was right now. So check the website. Topics I don't really decide until about 45 minutes beforehand, but we do have some of these left in the slides, so we might just do more of these. But we might not. It all depends on how I feel that day, really. But thank you. That's it. We're going to kill the recording here. Good afternoon, good evening, good night, good luck. And see y'all back in 2 weeks.